My name is Moorea. I studied at the University of Cambridge. I now work as an editor, and I, in the past, have also worked as someone working for an NGO accelerator and a brand consultant. And I also currently am working as an actor and comedian. Yes, as Sunny says as well, I also recently changed my hair color yesterday, in fact, and it wasn't quite what I asked for, which I'm sure we've all experienced, going to the hairdressers and not quite getting what you wanted from them. But yes, that's me. And let's think then about today's agenda. So over the course of today's session, we're going to be thinking about three sort of core things. First of all, we're going to be looking at the background behind the EU Green Deal and the recent ban on petrol and diesel cars in the EU. We'll then be looking at this particular article. And then finally, we'll be taking a look at some of the things that we've seen in the article in a more interactive way through a practice quiz. So let's start with a little icebreaker poll. And I'm actually interested to hear, first of all, where you usually find your economic news. So when you're looking for things about, the automotive industry, the semiconductor industry, the battery industry, where do you go? Do you go to social media and look for journalists on Twitter? Do you rely on your friends and your colleagues to share what they know with you? Or do you prefer to stick with kind of more old school media, newspapers, or maybe digital newsletters that you get delivered to your email address? I'll let you guys have another few seconds to respond there. But it seems like there's a strong consensus here. There's strong agreement here. So let's go ahead and take a look at these results. What we can see here is that a lot of you, the bulk of you actually, tend to rely on newspapers and newsletters, and I'm definitely the same. I think that they are often more reliable than what we hear from our friends and what we see on social media. But I also follow a lot of newspapers on social media, on Twitter and on Instagram. So I often find my news from those newspapers via social media as well. So I can definitely understand kind of both sides of that equation there. As a kind of broader icebreaker question as well, I'm interested to hear what you know about the European car industry. I'm specifically interested in hearing your ideas and your thoughts and your perspective on how much the EU car industry impacts business and trade within Korea. Do you feel that there is a lot of overlap here? Do you feel that the EU Green Deal and the ban on petrol and diesel cars in the EU will have an impact on Korean trade or Korean commerce in any way? So with all of that kind of knowledge and information in mind, let's take a look at the European Green Deal, this deal that sits at the heart of the topic of this particular webinar. So the European Green Deal was introduced back in 2019, and it has kind of three core objectives. And these are pledges. It has kind of pledged that it is going to commit to these things. The first is that there will be no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. So the EU will be entirely carbon neutral. Apologies. The second is that the EU is going to find ways of taking economic growth away from resource use. And the third is that no person and no place will be left behind. And the EU has also pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. So let's take a look at each of the three of these in a bit more detail. First of all, we have this no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. And this would make the EU the first carbon neutral continent, which is massive. This would be a massive achievement if the EU is able to achieve it. Secondly, like we saw here, we have this phrase, decouple from resource use. And what this means is that the EU wants to encourage businesses to start selling products and developing services that don't rely on the use of limited resources, like mining minerals, for example, or fossil fuels. And of course, this will particularly impact industries like the battery industry, which relies on lithium, or the semiconductor industry, which similarly relies on a lot of very limited natural resources that have to be mined. So this is an interesting one and something that might kind of get in the way of their goal of reaching carbon neutral by 2050. And then finally, we have this goal, no person and no place left behind. And this one's a bit broader. What this means is that everything that the EU plans to do to reach those first two goals shouldn't be at the expense of marginalized groups or places. So the people who live on the outskirts of society, maybe people who are incredibly poor, or people who are refugees, or who in some other way feel like they can't exist within mainstream society. But it should also make sure to include every area of Europe. So these shouldn't just be policies that benefit cities. These should be policies that benefit remote and rural areas as well. So it's a big, complicated ambition that the EU has. And let's think now about the pros and cons of it. What do other people think? How realistic is this? Well, we'll start with the pros. And I mean, we'll start with the obvious, which is that we are experiencing a climate crisis, absolutely and undeniably, and we need to take urgent action in order to combat that climate crisis. And luckily, this plan will go a fairly long way to kind of addressing that climate crisis. The second point is that this deal has already had a kind of proven impact on the EU's startup infrastructure, and specifically on the kind of startup culture of green, renewable, sort of ESG-focused startups. So the value of the green startup industry in the EU more than doubled in just 1 year from 2020 to 2021, which is incredible. And it now sits at over 100 billion euros. So this is having an immediate and a very positive impact on green business specifically. And finally, there is this kind of broader point that's important to make. We saw earlier that this would make the EU the first carbon neutral continent if it can successfully pull it off. But it would be impossible for another continent to even try to achieve this, because it would require that continent, or each country within that continent, to agree to all of these rules and regulations on an individual basis. The EU is able to achieve this because it is one organization, it is one body acting to represent the needs of every single country within the EU. And so this is a really cool example of what the EU can do, and the power of this sort of collective organization. There are, however, some cons. And the first and biggest of these cons is that this plan didn't really make anyone happy. So when we're thinking about both climate activists and also people within industry, neither side of this kind of conflict were satisfied by the deal. On one side, climate activists felt that this didn't go far enough. The EU wasn't acting fast enough. They argued by 2050 it's going to be too late. And they argued that, you know, the EU was greenwashing itself. Now, greenwashing is a term that we use to talk about businesses, corporations, nations using the language associated with green policies, environmentally conscious policies, to make themselves look better, to make themselves look more eco-friendly than they actually are, regardless of whether or not that's actually the case. And so these climate activists said, yeah, I mean, it all sounds really good, but this is just greenwashing. It sounds good, but it doesn't actually have the kind of substance behind it to make it as good as it sounds. And then on the other side of that divide, industry leaders, by contrast, felt that the EU was going too far. So climate activists said they're not going far enough. Industry leaders said they're going too far. And they were particularly concerned by this specific part of the plan, which is the EU's new focus on a circular economy. Now, a circular economy is all about reusing, recycling goods rather than purchasing new goods. And of course, this worried a lot of business people because they said, well, if we're manufacturing and selling new goods, those new goods might end up being undervalued within the EU because of its shift to looking at sort of reselling existing goods. And then the other side of the kind of arguments against the EU Green Deal were that a lot of people on both sides of that divide, both climate activists and industry leaders, felt that the Green Deal just didn't have enough money behind it. The EU promised all of these kind of massive quantities of money. So 11 trillion euros, which is a massive amount of money to the deal. But actually, when people started looking at where that money was coming from and what that money meant, what they saw was that actually very little of that money was new. A lot of that money is money that the EU was already spending on encouraging startup development, developing green or sustainable infrastructures within countries. And the EU had kind of just relabeled it. So it had gone, oh, well, let's just slap the EU Green Deal label on this. And we can use this to sort of bump up the numbers. And what industry leaders and climate activists are concerned about is that the EU hasn't really thought about how much all of this stuff that it wants is really going to cost. And it isn't prepared to put the money behind making sure that this happens in a way that isn't disruptive to businesses. So it's a complicated, very ambitious, but not totally well-liked deal within Europe. And before we move on to looking at the article, let's just think about the kind of timeline of what's going to happen within this deal. So it was announced back in 2019. And then as part of this deal, the EU then announced the 2035 petrol and diesel car ban, the ban on all ICE vehicles. Now, an ICE vehicle is an internal combustion engine vehicle, so a vehicle that runs on fuel, petrol or diesel. The EU announced the ban back in 2022. Earlier this year, EU lawmakers approved the plan. They said, yes, this can go ahead. And that means that by 2035, no new ICE vehicles will be allowed to be sold. You can still drive your old ones, but you can't sell new ones. So what does this mean kind of in practice? The interesting thing is that you can still buy and sell second-hand ICE vehicles. So if you had a new standard diesel car that you had bought in 2034, you could sell that car in 2040. As long as the vehicle was new before the date of 2035, you can continue to sell any kind of diesel or petrol cars looking into the future. You can also still use them. So they'll still have petrol stations and gas stations. You'll still be able to buy fuel, use fuel in your cars. All of that will still be possible within Europe. But what the EU is hoping, and this all is sort of working towards that end goal of carbon neutral by 2050, is that if the EU introduces this ban in 2035, in the 15 years between 2035 and 2050, gradually all of the new petrol and diesel cars will be phased out of use. And the EU has estimated that the average lifespan of a car in Europe is about 15 years. So if it starts in 2035, by 2050, it'll all be done. So there's one big issue here, and the EU is very aware of this issue. This is on the kind of the homepage of the ICE vehicle ban on the EU website, which is that electric cars are really expensive. And we'll be thinking more about that over the course of this article as well. Now, they are really expensive everywhere, but they are specifically really expensive in Europe because European car manufacturers haven't really kind of developed the technology necessary to produce them cheaply. So the EU is trying to kind of manage concerns about this. And the EU said, today, electric cars are expensive. The new rules should encourage more competition and encourage manufacturers to invest in research and innovation into electric vehicles, which should drive the purchase price down. And I think the really important word there is competition. The EU is relying on competition within the European car market to help make the prices of electric vehicles more affordable for the average European citizen. And again, we can think more about that over the course of this session. So let's then think about the article in question. And this particular article is a really interesting one. It's by Forbes. And there's a lot of interesting language in this article. So we'll think about the topic itself, but we'll also be thinking about the language that's being used to talk about this topic. For folks who still have questions, definitely keep putting them in the Zoom chat, and we'll make time to sort of return to a few of them at the end of this session as well. So this article is on the EU electric car insistence, exposing auto industry to an existential threat. And even in that title, we can see some fairly emotionally charged language like existential threat. So let's take a look at the three key passages that we'll be covering over the course of this session. The first passage will explore the EU outlawing ICE vehicles. We'll then be looking at how Chinese BEVs, they are battery electric vehicles, are outclassing EU competition. And finally, we'll be thinking about what industry pundits are saying and the fact that, spoiler alert, they remain divided. So let's jump into this first article, this first section of the article. The EU is outlawing ICE vehicles. And this particular passage covers the fact that from 2035, all new internal combustion engine vehicles or ICE vehicles will be banned in the EU, which means the only viable options will be battery electric vehicles or BEVs. And EU car manufacturers are concerned that this will lead to the EU car market being dominated by Chinese brands. So let's take a look at this particular passage, and I'll read it out for you. The EU is outlawing ICE vehicles. The EU is outlawing the sale of new internal combustion engine, or ICE, powered vehicles by gradually cracking down on carbon dioxide or CO2 emissions to the point in 2035 when only new battery electric vehicles or BEVs will be viable. The insistence on electric cars is winning plaudits from environmental groups, but the mass market is likely to be dominated by Chinese automakers with their competitive sedans and SUVs, which can't be matched by Europe. This will likely mean financial losses for the manufacturers and big job losses. So I want to first of all start with this word viable and think about how it's being used here. In a broad sense, viable refers to something meaning, to something being possible or achievable. So I could say that's a viable business plan. But here it's being used to talk about what sort of vehicles will be kind of realistically possible to use from 2035. And this article is saying that from 2035, if we're all being realistic, we'll only be able to drive electric vehicles. Now, this is a bit of a complicated issue because a lot of different publications are talking about how, at the moment, electric vehicles aren't viable because they're not affordable. So there is no technology available that will allow for the mass adoption of electric vehicles at a price that the average consumer can afford. And if the average consumer can't afford them, then they aren't viable. Now, there's differing opinions here. The World Economic Forum argues that actually electric vehicles are cheaper than we think they are, because actually they are much cheaper to run than a petrol or diesel car. But there's an interesting thing happening with this word viable, because this article is saying by 2035, only electric vehicles will be viable. But currently, there's this sort of general consensus that electric vehicles just aren't viable. And that means we have a lot of work to do within the next 10 to 15 years to make them viable. There's also some interesting language in this article, and this will introduce a kind of broader theme that I want to explore over the course of this session, and that I want you to be mindful of as we move through this session, which is that this article very clearly is pushing a specific perspective. This article is pushing the perspective that this is a bad thing. The EU ban on ICE vehicles is a bad thing. And we can see that the article is pushing this perspective by its use of what we call leading language. Now, leading language is language that is designed to lead the reader to adopt a certain opinion, or believe a certain thing, or feel a certain emotion. So it's often very emotional language or very dramatic language. And we've got a few examples of that here. These words outlaw and crack down, and this verb dominate. Now, outlaw and crack down are really interestingly both words that we use to talk about police states, the military, this sort of restrictive law and order. And by using these words, this article is pushing this idea that the EU is being militant, that it is restricting people's freedoms in a way that is sort of undemocratic. So let's look at some examples of that. This word outlaw is outlawing the sale of new internal combustion engines. Now, we can use outlaw to talk about kind of banning things, but it's more common to see outlaw being used to talk about kind of the introduction of law and order to like the Wild West. You know, outlaws are cowboys who committed crimes and have been pushed out of society, rejected from society. They reject law and order. So this word outlaw is very specifically tied to the introduction of new laws, and those new laws making certain people or certain ideas or opinions feel unacceptable or unwelcome. Similarly, we've got this verb crack down, which is idiomatic. And crack down, again, is an idiom that we use when we are talking about laws restricting freedom. So again, we can use it in a more neutral sense. We can say that, you know, we're cracking down on drunk driving or things like that. But equally, we will see crack down being used to talk about governments restricting the freedoms of individuals. So, Soviet Russia cracked down on free speech. Soviet Russia prevented journalists from speaking freely. And it's often a word that we associate with dictatorships. So again, very strong language being used here. And then we have this verb dominate. And dominate we do use quite commonly in these sorts of articles. It's a useful word to have at your disposal, but it's still a very strong piece of language because it's borrowed from this language of aggression and violence, and it conveys this very exaggerated sense of force. So there is a lot of strong language being used to describe the EU's plan to ban ICE vehicles. And it's important to be aware of that as we move through our discussion of this article, because at the end, I want us to think about how this language might impact our opinion about this ban on ICE vehicles. But before we get into all of that, let's do a little quiz based on this particular passage. So according to the passage, What will be banned from 2035? Is it ICE cars? Is it BEVs? Or is it straws? So I'll give you a couple of seconds here to sort of put your answers, put your thoughts into this. And all of these are acronyms. So which acronym do you think is right? I think it's important to look at this because actually these are all quite complicated acronyms, and they're going to come up quite a lot over the course of this particular discussion. So let's clarify their meaning now. So let's take a look at these mini quiz results. And the majority of you are right. We are thinking about ICE cars, internal combustion engine cars. But there's also a bit of a joke because ICE is something that you put in a drink. A bev is slang for a beverage or a drink, and a straw is also something that you put in a drink. So I was like, well, let's make a fun little joke here. But yes, so let's continue looking at another passage. And here we'll be thinking about Chinese BEVs, battery electric vehicles, outclassing EU competition. So the CEO of Emissions Analytics, who we hear from a lot in this article, feels that Europe has played into China's hands, especially because Chinese BEVs are currently being sold for half the price of their EU competitors. And this man predicts that this will cause carnage in the EU automotive industry. So already we can see some strong language there. Let's take a look at this particular passage. Nick Molden, CEO of independent emissions testing company Emissions Analytics, said China has a smart strategy and Europe has played into its hands. We are seeing Chinese vehicles priced at £25,000, competing with similar European vehicles priced between £40,000 and £50,000. And this is going to be carnage for Europe's auto industry. There will be very strong pressure for tariff or other protections, Molden said in an interview. The EU Commission is caught between political consensus established by environmental organizations and an industrial crisis, which they just don't know what to do about, he said. So let's take a look at some of the language here. And again, we've got some more leading language, play into one's hands, and that word carnage. And then we've also got this lovely phrase caught between, which is a great phrase that you can use in your own writing as well. And we'll think about how you can, and that noun and consensus. So let's start by looking at this leading language. And we'll start with this idiom, play into someone's hands. Now, if you play into someone's hands, you fall for a trick that they have made on you. And in doing so, you hurt yourself and you benefit them in some way. Now, this idiom comes from the language that we use to describe card games. It's an idiom that is derived from card games. And so it's often associated with all of the sorts of people who do card games, play card games, tricksters, gamblers, people who are generally not very trustworthy. And in using it here, this particular person, Molden, is suggesting that the EU has essentially made a gamble, or it has fallen for a gamble made by China. And there is this general sense of the EU and China gambling and not taking things seriously or not being trustworthy. So we can see here an example that this celebrity played into the critics' hands, for example. We've also got this word carnage. And this, to me, is a really kind of clear example of leading language because it's really, really strong. The word carnage is very violent. We often use it to talk about gruesome mass murder, gruesome destruction. So, you know, we talk about battles and wars and natural disasters resulting in carnage. And carnage often means that there is massive loss of life. So it's a very, very strong word to use to talk about industry. And again, it's leading people to have a very kind of strong, scared, emotional response. And then we've got this idiom. Well, this phrase caught between isn't an idiom, but it borrows from an idiom, caught between a rock and a hard place. And this idiom means that you are stuck between two equally bad decisions. Neither decision is a good one. And we can take that phrase caught between and we can sort of put our own bad options into this particular phrase. So here, this poor person is in a situation where they have to choose between losing their job and losing their marriage. And they can say, I was caught between losing my job and losing my marriage. Again, two equally bad decisions. There's no good answer there. And then finally, we have this very useful word, consensus. And consensus refers to general, universal, unanimous agreement. We use it a lot in discussions of business and politics. It's a great word to use in your own writing. You might say that your bosses, for example, came to the consensus that you deserve a promotion. So some big ideas here and some strong language being used to describe them. So let's take a look at this particular mini quiz. According to the passage, Chinese vehicles are priced at £25,000. And I've just completely mucked up reading that. Chinese vehicles priced at £25,000 are equivalent to what? So again, pop your answers into this mini quiz. Again, there seems to be a strong consensus among most of you, and that strong consensus happens to be right. The majority of you seem to be getting this question right. So let's take a look at this particular mini quiz's results. And the majority of you are right. 73% of you felt that the e-vehicles were priced between £40,000 and £60,000. And the interesting thing to note here is that they are twice as expensive. So very much bear that in mind. There's no equivalent in Europe currently that are the same price as these Chinese equivalents. And we'll think about what that might mean for the EU car industry. For now, though, let's move on to passage 3. And here we're thinking about different opinions. So pundits remain divided. We are introduced to an analyst at Grant Thornton who feels that we don't need to be too concerned. And this person feels that Chinese BEVs, will still be subject to import taxes. We might introduce tariffs. There are different ways in which we can make them more expensive. But again, we hear once more from Molden, the CEO of Emissions Analytics, who remains troubled. So interesting to hear these two perspectives. And actually, with Youngjan's question in mind, let's also think about how these two perspectives are treated by the person who has written this article. So let's take a look at this passage. Pundits remain divided. Owen Edwards, analyst at Grant Thornton UK, has a more relaxed view of the China threat, which has to beat the 10% EU import tariff. There have been suggestions the EU raise this to slow China a bit, while the threat of tariffs might persuade the Chinese to tone down the threat. But Molden sees serious consequences for Europe. What happens when the mass market needs electric vehicles? Even now, we are running short of those willing to pay the price. There is significant entry by the Chinese with heavily subsidized vehicles. European car makers will suffer because they can't compete on price, and fortunes will be lost by the mass market European car makers. So, again, some strong language being used there. What happens when? This very emotive rhetorical question, that verb suffer, and this sort of idiomatic, not quite idiomatic, but certainly very visual use of language. Fortunes will be lost. And we also have just some more useful bits of vocabulary, words like tone down and subsidize, which are useful to use in your own writing as well. But let's start with actually those more neutral bits of vocab. So first of all, we've got this verb tone down. And if you tone something down, you make it less harsh, less dramatic. This is actually kind of idiomatic. It's quite casual, actually, as a piece of vocabulary, although we do see it in corporate contexts quite a lot. You might talk about toning down an email where you have to complain about something or report bad behavior. It's very much about making sure that the tone of your writing or whatever it is that you are saying isn't going to be interpreted as aggressive or offensive or upsetting. So here the Chinese are making, their inroads into the EU car industry less aggressive, less upsetting. Let's think then about some of this more emotive language. And first of all, we've got this idiom, this rhetorical question: what happens when? Now, it's important, first of all, to ask the question, what is a rhetorical question? And a rhetorical question is any question that is not designed to be answered. It is designed to provoke thought or prompt a certain emotion or lead the reader or the listener to believe a certain thing. We often hear rhetorical questions used in speeches. So a military general, to inspire his troops, might say, "Who will stand with me? Who will stand up to the threat of the invaders?" And he's not literally asking, each individual person in that room, "Hey, are you with me? Are you going to stand up for me?" He's asking that question to provoke people to feel that without necessarily feeling like they have to say it out loud or respond literally. So a rhetorical question is a very well-known tool for provoking strong responses. And we often use it when, there are heated emotions. So if you're having an argument, for example, with a colleague, you might say, "Well, what happens when your plan backfires? Look, it's not worth the risk." And you're not literally asking your colleague to explain what would happen if their plan backfired, but you are just kind of trying to make them think about that, consider the possible negative consequences of their actions. So again, a very strong use of language here. Then we have this nice word, subsidize. Again, a very useful word. We can use it both as a verb. So I subsidize something, which means I sort of make it cheaper or more affordable by putting money towards it. But we can also use it as an adjective. Now, something is subsidized, then that means that it is made more affordable because financial support has been provided. And often it's used when we're talking about governments or institutions. Your company might offer you a subsidized MBA. Your company will offer to pay a certain amount of money to help you do your MBA. Or you might only be able to afford a house by taking out a subsidized government loan. So a very useful word whenever we're thinking about money being provided to make things more affordable for us. Interestingly here, Malden is saying that Chinese vehicles are heavily subsidized, but they're not. So this is a very neutral piece of language, but it's being used by Malden to be misleading. No one is subsidizing these vehicles. It's not like the government in the EU is offering people money to make Chinese vehicles cheaper. They are just cheaper. There's no subsidizing happening here. So this is quite misleading because what this is implying is, oh, the EU are making Chinese vehicles cheaper than the, local alternatives, which isn't the case. Chinese vehicles are just cheaper. That's just the fact. It's not the fault of the EU. So again, neutral language, but being used in a quite misleading way. And then we have this verb suffer. And again, suffer is quite a common word. We see it in articles quite a lot. but it's a word that comes from the language of violence. It's associated with physical pain, physical discomfort, aggression, conflict, in exactly the same way as dominated and carnage. What you'll notice is that we have this sustained vocabulary of violence being used to describe what the EU is doing to the European car industry. And that makes the EU's behavior seem violent, seem aggressive, because we have this sustained pattern of language. And there is a technical word for this. You don't need to know the technical word, but it's important to just, hear it. And this technical word is a lexical field. Now, a lexical field is basically just a group of vocabulary that all belongs to the same thing. So suffer, dominate, carnage, they all belong to the same core idea of physical aggression or physical violence. And here, this author is using a lexical field of violence to make the EU seem aggressive. And then finally, we have this very dramatic phrase, fortunes will be lost. And we use this sort of phrase to talk about lost treasure. People say when the Titanic sank, fortunes were lost, because literally people's money sank to the bottom of the ocean and was lost. Fortune as a word refers to massive quantities of money. In a fantasy film, a dragon might be sitting on a fortune. And if you've seen the Hobbit movies, for example, or read The Hobbit, the book, Smaug, that dragon who sits on all of this like literal mountain of gold, Smaug has a fortune. So it's a big, strong word for talking about financial kind of reserves, if you like. And in using this phrase here, again, there's this very dramatic sense of, look at how much we're going to lose with this new law, this new regulation. So again, important to ask, how is that language making us feel about this law or this regulation? Let's take a look at another mini quiz. So according to this passage, what is the import tariff on Chinese BEVs currently? Is it 5%, is it 7%, or is it 10%? I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to respond to this. Okie doke, let's take a look at these answers. So yes, again, around 3/4 of you got this right. 10% is the current import tariff on all foreign vehicles. But as the article mentioned, this might be raised. Now, that would just make cars more expensive, which isn't really solving the problem here. But it would help to maybe limit the impact of Chinese vehicles on the EU automotive industry. So not a perfect solution, but maybe a little bit of a solution. So let's then wrap up. We'll think about what we learned today, and then we'll take all of these thoughts that we've just had, and we will apply them in a little interactive quiz at the end of this session. So first of all, what have we learned today? Well, we've learned that the EU Green Deal is built on these 3 core values, and we've looked at some of the pros and cons of those values. We've also thought about the potential consequences of banning ICE cars, what this means if people can't afford to buy BEVs, or if EU manufacturers can't compete with Chinese ones. And we've taken a look at 3 specific passages on outlawing ICE vehicles, on Chinese BEVs outclassing the EU competition, and on this sort of divided opinion that we are seeing within Europe. But we also looked at leading language, and we thought about how that language might be persuading us to believe certain things. So let's take a look at leading language together now. And we're going to do a little practice quiz to let you all kind of think about how you can correct leading language or avoid leading language in your own writing. So first of all, I want to ask you guys, which of these sentences feels the most non-biased or the most unbiased? Is it vegan activists strive to prevent animals from being murdered in slaughterhouses? Is it vegan activists have criticized meat-based food manufacturers? Or is it woke vegan snowflakes are trying to destroy our meat industry? So what we're looking for here is the one that is less biased, the one that is pushing, or the one that isn't pushing a specific opinion. As many of you said in the comments there, or Heather said in the comments there, nothing can be perfectly neutral. So all of these have a bit of an opinion in them, but which of these is the most neutral? So the majority of you went for number 2, and that's actually the one that I think is the least biased here. But there are a fair few of you as well who went for number 1. And I think it's important to think about what's making both number 1 and number 3 biased. Well, number 3 is fairly obviously biased because it's using all of these kind of political trigger words like woke and snowflakes. But the reason that number 1 feels a little bit biased is because we have very kind of emotional, aggressive language there. These animals are being murdered. They're being murdered in slaughterhouses. Slaughter, another word for murder. And we don't refer to abattoirs now as slaughterhouses because abattoir, which is the kind of term that we use now, it feels a bit more neutral, a bit less emotional than a slaughterhouse. So the most neutral one here, just because it avoids some of that politically charged language, is number 2. Criticize is a fairly neutral verb. Activist is a fairly neutral word. Meat-based food manufacturers is, again, a fairly kind of technical way of referring to those particular companies. So let's take a look then at number 2. Now that we've identified an example of a sentence that is biased, let's take a look at how we can make something more unbiased. So we've got this particular sentence from the article. Fortunes will be lost by the mass market European car makers. And I'm going to ask you now, which of these 3 feels the most neutral? European car manufacturers will be outclassed by superior Chinese vehicles. Mass market European car manufacturers must face the music. Or mass market European car manufacturers will likely see significant losses. So again, I'll give you guys a little bit of time. So let's take a look then at the answers to this second quiz. And the vast majority of you here getting this right. The more neutral one here is mass market European car manufacturers will likely see significant losses. And that's because it avoids more emotive bits of language like face the music. So idioms are often very emotive because they borrow from very sort of emotional origins. Face the music is all about sort of coming to terms with, your own loss, the fact that you've lost something. But it also avoids bits of strong language like outclass and superior, language that clearly sort of leads us to believe that Chinese vehicles are inherently better. So that's why number 3 is the best one there. Let's take a look then at the third question. Again, we're taking a look at another sentence from this article. This is going to be carnage for Europe's auto industry. And again, I'm interested in your opinion here. What's the most neutral one? This will likely spell trouble for Europe's auto industry. This will be the death of Europe's auto industry. And this could prove an annoyance for Europe's auto industry. Now, this one's a little bit trickier. I want to challenge you guys to really kind of think about what's the most neutral here. Like Heather said, nothing's going to be perfectly neutral, but which of these is the most neutral? So let's take a look at these results. And this is really interesting. People are quite divided. People generally agree that number 2 is wrong, and they would be right because death is so over-exaggerative, it's so hyperbolic. But the best of the 3 here is number 1. So number 1 is an idiom. But yes, number 1 is an idiom. Spell trouble is idiomatic. But here the language is proportionate. So this will spell trouble. This will be disruptive for the EU car industry. Annoyance feels like it might be more neutral, but really it's kind of an under-exaggeration. If something's annoying, then it's not kind of seriously bad. It's just sort of like, oh, go away. It's more trivial. It's not as sort of serious or impactful. And this will definitely do more than just be an annoyance. So annoyance is an under-exaggeration, death is an over-exaggeration, and we land somewhere in the middle with spell trouble. And that's why it's the best answer there. So well done for those of you who got that right, because that was a tricky one. And then let's take a look at some more neutral bits of vocabulary. So what's a more neutral alternative to the word outlaw? Is it prohibit, demonize, or push underground? And this is really challenging because this is asking you guys to think about not just the meaning of the word, but the sort of broader feelings that a word evokes. Let's take a look at these answers here. And actually, there's a fairly clear consensus, to use that word again, among all of you guys. Prohibit is the most neutral, and you are right. Demonize is too strong. You know, it's got that sense of someone being a demon, which is very strong. And push underground might not seem like it's particularly strong, but it's an idiom that specifically kind of creates this sense of some sort of social movement, some sort of resistance or rebellion or uprising. The civil rights movement in the US, where they abolished slavery, happened underground. People couldn't talk about it publicly. They had to talk about it in secret. So although it seems quite neutral, there's nothing particularly strong or dramatic there. Just the associations with that particular idiom make it a piece of leading language. And then finally, another bit of vocabulary. Here we have this idiom crack down on. So again, what do you think is the more neutral piece of vocabulary here? Seek and destroy, take stronger action against, or punish? I will let you all take another sort of 10 seconds or so to answer that. Let's take a look at these answers. Yes, the majority of you saying take stronger action against. And punish is a fairly common word. We see it in articles a lot. The reason that I would say that punish is leading language, although it's not a very bad piece of leading language, is that punish introduces an idea of morality. If you punish something, then you're saying you did a bad thing, and therefore you sort of deserve this punishment that I'm going to give you. So punishment, and the idea of punish introduces a sense of good and bad. Seek and destroy very clearly is a strong piece of vocabulary there. There's an idiom that is borrowed from the military, and specifically military missiles. So very, very strong. But we can see here that the more neutral piece of language is kind of long. Take stronger action against. And this goes back to some of the questions that have been asked in the chat. You know, how much is it a journalist's responsibility to make their language neutral? Now, a journalist might reasonably decide, hey, I need to get this article under 400 words. So I'm going to use the word punish rather than take stronger action against, because I need to get it under the word count. So even though punish is a slightly leading language, it's shorter and therefore perhaps easier to understand for some people than take stronger action against. So the more neutral piece of language there, but maybe not the piece of language that most journalists would use.
Thank you, Moorea, so much for preparing and hosting for today's session. 그럼 지금까지 모레아 튜터분께서 4월 라이브 세션 세 번째 라이브를 진행을 해주셨습니다. 그럼 여기까지 오늘 라이브 마치도록 하겠습니다. 다음 주 수요일 4월 26일 오후 9시에 예정된 4회차 마지막 라이브 때 뵙도록 하겠습니다.